Hello, almost second graders. I hope all of you are having a really good summer. I realized that we got a little caught up in our fun and that we forgot to finish our book on the last day of school. So I thought that I would take this time to read our last two chapters of Mr. Popper's Penguins. If you remember, when we left off, the Penguins and Mr. Popper had just came into the wrong place to perform, and they met the Seals. So now they are escorting Mr. Popper away, the police are. So let's figure out what happens next. Chapter 19 is called Admiral Drake. Think about who Admiral Drake was. We learned about him at the very beginning of the story. So Mr. Popper with Captain Cook, Greta, Columbus, Louisa, Nelson, Jenny, Magellan, Adelina, Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria was bundled into the patrol wagon and hustled off to the police station. None of his pleas could move the desk sergeant. That theater manager is pretty mad at the way you busted into his theater, so I'm holding you. I'm going to give you all a nice quiet cell, unless you furnish bail. I'm putting the bail at $500 for you and $100 for each of the birds. I don't remember how many birds there are, right? Bail is the amount of money that you need to pay to get out of jail without spending time there. Of course, Mr. Popper did not have that much money. Neither did Mrs. Popper when they telephoned her at the hotel. The hotel bill was paid for several days ahead, but she had no cash. The check for the final week's salary was not due until the end of the week. Indeed, it now looked as if the Poppers would never see that check, since they could not get the Penguins out of jail long enough to put on their act at the Royal Theater. If only they could have got in touch with Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper knew that kind man would have got them out. But Mr. Greenbaum was somewhere in Hollywood, out on the Pacific coast, and the Poppers had no idea how to reach him. It was very dull for the birds in jail. Wednesday came, and there was still no word from Mr. Greenbaum. Thursday, and the birds began to droop. It means like sag. It was soon apparent that the lack of exercise, combined with the heat, might prove too much for them. There were no more tricks or merry games. Even the younger birds sat all day in dismal silence, and Mr. Popper could not cheer them up. Mr. Popper had a feeling that Mr. Greenbaum would probably turn up by the end of the week to see about renewing the contract. But Friday passed without any news of him. Saturday morning, Mr. Popper got up very early and smoothed his hair. Then he dusted off the Penguins as well as he could, for he wanted everything to look as presentable as possible in case Mr. Greenbaum should appear. About 10 o'clock, there was a sound of footsteps in the corridor and a jingle of keys, and the door of the cell was opened. "You're free, Mr. Popper. There's a friend of yours here." Mr. Popper stepped out into the light with the Penguins. "You're barely in time, Mr. Greenbaum," he was about to say. Then, as his eyes became accustomed to the light, he looked again. It was not Mr. Greenbaum who stood there. It was a great bearded man in a splendid uniform. Smiling, he held out his hand to Mr. Popper. "Mr. Popper," he said, "I'm Admiral Drake." "Admiral Drake?" gasped Mr. Popper. "Not back from the South Pole?" "Yes," said the Admiral. "The Drake Antarctic Expedition ship returned yesterday. You should have seen the reception New York gave us. You can read about it in today's paper. But I read about the trouble you were having over the penguins, and so here I am. I have a long story to tell you." "Could we go to the hotel and talk about it?" asked Mr. Popper. "My wife will be anxious to see us back." "Certainly," said the Admiral. And when they were all settled in the Poppers' room at the hotel, with the penguins clustered around to listen, Admiral Drake began. "Naturally, when I knew that I was coming back to America, I often thought about the man to whom I had sent the penguin. It takes us a long time to hear things down there, and I often wondered how you and the bird were getting along. Last night at the mayor's dinner for us, I heard about the wonderful Trained Penguin Act that you had been putting on all over the country. This morning, I picked up the paper, and the first thing I read was that Mr. Popper and his 12 penguins were still being held in jail." "But 12 penguins? Mr. Popper, how on earth?" Now, why would Admiral Drake be surprised? Think about how many penguins Admiral Drake knew about. Just one, right? Just Captain Cook. And the reason we have more penguins is because of Greta. Then Mr. Popper told how Greta had arrived to keep Captain Cook from being lonely, and how the little penguins had grown, and how the clever little band had saved the day for the Poppers when things looked bad. "It's amazing," said Admiral Drake. "I've seen a lot of penguins in my life, but never such educated ones as these. It certainly shows what patience and training can do. But now to get to the real point, Mr. Popper. You probably know that I've explored the North Pole as well as the South Pole." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper respectfully. "I have read books about both your Arctic and your Antarctic expeditions." "Well then," said the Admiral, "maybe you know why we explorers prefer the South Pole." "Could it be on account of the penguins, sir?" asked Janie, who had been listening very hard. Remember, Janie is Mr. Popper's daughter. Admiral Drake patted her head. "Yes, my dear. Those long polar nights get pretty dull when you have no pets to play with. Of course, there are polar bears up there, but you can't play with them. Nobody knows why there are no penguins at the North Pole. For a long time, the United States government has been wanting me to lead an expedition up there for the purpose of establishing a breed of penguins. I must come to the point, Mr. Popper. You've had such remarkable success with these birds of yours. Why not let me take them to the North Pole and start a race of penguins there?" Just then, Mr. Greenbaum and another gentleman were announced. They shook hands all around and were introduced to the Admiral. "Well, Popper," said Mr. Greenbaum, "too bad about the mix-up over the theaters, but never mind. Here's Mr. Klein, who owns the Colossal Film Company. He's going to make you a fortune. You'll be a poor man no longer, Mr. Popper." "Poor?" said Mr. Popper. "I'm not poor. These birds have been earning us $5,000 a week." "Oh, $5,000, said Mr. Klein. "What's that? Pin money. I want to put those birds in the movies, Mr. Popper. We've got the story department working on stories for them already. Why, I'll put each of those birds under a contract that will keep you and the missus on Easy Street for the rest of your lives." So he's saying that whatever money that he offers Mr. Popper is going to make it so that him and Mrs. Popper don't have to worry about money anymore. "Papa," whispered Mrs. Popper, "I don't want to live on Easy Street. I want to go back to Proudfoot Avenue." "Better consider, Mr. Popper," said the Admiral. "I can't offer you anything like that." "You say those men at the North Pole get lonely because there are no penguins?" asked Mr. Popper. "Very lonely," said the Admiral. "But if there were penguins up there, mightn't the polar bears eat them?" "Oh, ordinary penguins, yes," said the Admiral. but not such highly trained birds as yours, Mr. Popper. They could outwit any polar bear. It was now Mr. Klein's turn to speak. Now, Mr. Klein is the man that wants him to pick the movie deal. So Mr. Popper has to decide between sending the penguins to the North Pole or to sending the penguins to Mr. Klein so he can make a movie. In every moving picture house in America, little children would have the pleasure of seeing stories acted out by the Poppers performing penguins, he said. Of course, if we succeed in establishing the breed of the North Pole, said the Admiral, the name might have to be changed a little. I imagine that hundreds of years from now, scientists will be calling them the Popper Arctic penguins. Mr. Popper was silent for a moment. Gentlemen, he said, I want to thank you both. I'll give my decision tomorrow. And that is the end of the 19th chapter. And now we are on to the final chapter, chapter 20. What do you think he's going to decide? Do you think Mr. Popper will have the penguins go to the North Pole with Admiral Drake? Or do you think that he will have them make a movie with Mr. Klein? This chapter is titled, Farewell, Mr. Popper. It was a hard decision to make. Long after the visitors had gone, Mr. and Mrs. Popper sat and discussed what was best for everybody. Mrs. Popper could see the advantages of both offers, and she pointed these out, without trying to influence him, so without trying to make Mr. Popper decide. I feel that the penguins are really your responsibility, she said, and you must make up your mind. It was a pale Mr. Popper who was ready to announce his decision the next day. Mr. Klein, he said, I want you to know how much I appreciate your offer of putting my birds in the movies, but I am afraid I have to refuse. I do not believe the life in Hollywood would be good for the penguins. Then he turned to Admiral Drake. Admiral Drake, I am going to give you the birds. In doing this, I am considering the birds first of all. I know that they have been comfortable and happy with me. Lately, though, with the excitement and the warm weather, I've been worried about them. The birds have done so much for me that I have to do what's best for them. After all, they belong in a cold climate. And then I can't help being sorry for those men at the North Pole without any penguins to help them pass the time. Your government will thank you, Mr. Popper, answered the Admiral. Congratulations, Admiral, said Mr. Klein. Maybe you're right at that, Popper. Hollywood might have been too much for the birds. I wish you'd let me make one short movie of them here in New York, though. Before they go. Just some pictures of the sort of things they do on the stage, you know? We'd show the film everywhere with an announcement that these are the famous Popper's penguins that are being taken to the North Pole by Admiral Drake of the United States Arctic Penguin Foundation Expedition, or something like that. I'd like that very much, said Mr. Popper. We'd pay you, of course, continued Mr. Klein. Not a fortune, as we could have if you have let us done the contract, but say $25,000. So Mr. Klein is offering to do a little short movie for them before they go to the North Pole and still pay Mr. Popper some money. We could use it, said Mrs. Popper. It will be very quiet at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper, when everyone had left. Mrs. Popper did not answer. She knew that nothing she could say would really comfort him. However, said Mr. Popper, now that it's spring here, a lot of people will be wanting their houses painted, so we better be getting back. Anyway, said Bill, we've had 10 whole weeks of vacation right in the middle of the year, and not many children in Stillwater can say that. So this is Admiral Drake and the penguins, and Mr. Klein and Mr. Popper. The next day, the cameraman arrived to make the picture of the penguins doing the tricks. It was arranged that the Poppers should stay in New York just long enough to see the expedition off. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the great sailing ship of Admiral Drake was being made ready for its long trip north. Every day, huge boxes of supplies of all sorts were hustled on board. The most comfortable quarters on the ship were turned over to the penguins, who were the cause of the voyage. So the penguins got to sleep in the most comfortable part of the ship, because that's why they were taking the trip. Captain Cook was already quite familiar with the ship, since it was the same one that Admiral had sailed to the to the South Pole, where Captain Cook had often seen it. Greta, too, had seen vessels of its kind. The two of them were kept very busy showing and explaining everything to Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. The sailors all took the greatest delight in watching the curious little birds at their explorations. It looks as if this will be a pretty lively trip, they would say. These Popper penguins certainly live up to their reputation. But at last, everything was ready, and the day came when the Poppers were to go down and say goodbye. Bill and Janie ran all over the ship and did not want to leave when it was time to draw up the gangplank. The Admiral shook hands with them and Mrs. Popper and thanked them for having helped to train the extraordinary penguins that were to be a real contribution to science. Mr. Popper had gone down below to say a private farewell to the birds. All that kept him from breaking down completely was the knowledge that what he was doing was the best for them. First, he said goodbye to all the younger penguins. Then to Greta, who had saved Captain Cook. Then, last of all, he leaned over and said a special goodbye to Captain Cook, who had come and made life so different for Mr. Popper. Then he wiped his eyes, straightened his back, and went up to the deck to say goodbye to Admiral Drake. It's hard to say goodbye to those penguins for him, huh? Goodbye, Admiral Drake, he said. Goodbye, repeated the Admiral. Why, what do you mean? Aren't you coming with us? Me? Go with you to the North Pole? Why, of course, Mr. Popper. But how could I go with you? I'm not an explorer or a scientist. I'm only a house painter. You're the keeper of the penguins, aren't you? Roared the Admiral. Man alive, aren't those penguins the reason for this whole expedition? And who's going to see that they're well and happy if you're not along? Go put on one of those fur suits like the rest of us. We're pulling the anchor in a minute. What would that mean, pulling the anchor? Why would that be important? Pulling the anchor in a minute. Mama, shouted Mr. Popper to Mrs. Popper, who had already gone up the gangplank. She's already gotten off the ship. I'm going too. Admiral Drake says he needs me, Mama. Do you mind if I don't come home for a year or two? Oh, as to that, said Mrs. Popper, I'll miss you very much, my dear. But we have money to live on for a few years, and in winter it will be much easier to keep the house tidy without a man sitting around all day. I'll be getting back to Stillwater. Tomorrow is the day for the meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society, and I'll be just in time. So goodbye, my love, and good luck. Goodbye and good luck, echoed the children, and the penguins, hearing their voices, scuttled up on deck and stood there beside the Admiral and Mr. Popper. Then they solemnly lifted their flippers and waved as the great ship moved slowly down the river toward the sea. The end. What a great ending to that book, my friends. So it turns out Mr. Popper went with them to the North Pole. How nice. I hope you have a good rest of your summer, and I hope you enjoyed the ending of our book, Mr. Popper's Penguins.